Hi, and welcome to The Right Stuff. I'm the queen of Tuesday nights, Parker J. Thank you so much for joining me. If you have been wondering where I have been on hiatus. I had planned on doing a number of shows in August, but I got to tell you, I had some great news happen, and that actually took up a lot of time. And for those of you who don't know, that great news is I recently accepted a contract with Harlequin Mills and Boons for a historical romance novel set to come out in 2022. So I was working on the revisions all last month, as well as recovering from my health issues that I mentioned last month as well. So I'm glad to be back with you, and I hope you enjoy what we're going to have coming up in the next few weeks. We have some great content for you. Definitely want to thank all our supporters for their continued support, and for those authors who have been praying for me and the show in one way or another. I want to thank you for that. Thank our Patreon team for their continued support, as well as ChristianBookClub.net. Want to definitely thank them as well. For those of you who are wondering about what happened to Redio, Redio has decided to take a hiatus and focus on helping authors with their self-publishing efforts. So you can still find out how they can assist you by contacting them via Redio on the website. Really excited to see where they're going with helping authors publish and get more resources for their books. The best person to talk about the state of science fiction is my good friend Alan Sedum. Now, most of you know him from the series of interviews that we've done on Jordan's World, which you know I loved that story, as well as his release, his superhero release that we did a few months back. And so now he's back with me again, and we are just going to have the most fun, illuminating, fascinating conversation about the state of science fiction as we see it, where it contrasts with Christian sci-fi. What are some real-world concerns, some real-world positives, negatives, just a great conversation about the state of science fiction according to Alan and myself. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce to you Alan Sedum. Alan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Parker. It's great to be on with you. I'm a Christian fiction author. I'm from Texas. I'm married and have 3 children. I'm with Ambassador International. First book was called Mindfire. It's a superhero thriller. And I did the Jordan of Algren Christian Science Fantasy series. It's a trilogy with Jordan's World, as you mentioned, Jordan's Arrow, and Jordan's Deliverance. I had a short story in a sci-fi anthology that was just released and have stuff coming out next year as well. Always delighted to speak with you and to talk about Christian fiction and topics like sci-fi, which is close to my heart.
And we want to thank Ambassador International for the connection as always. They have a great catalog of fiction and nonfiction for you to enjoy. To know more about Ambassador International, go to ambassador-international.com. Why do you and I like sci-fi?
Oh, that's a loaded question.
I know, right?
Now, I mean, for me, it started back with Star Trek, the original series, and probably did for you too. Of course, Star Wars came out, and Battlestar Galactica. There's been a lot of great sci-fi TV and movies that have been an influence. And then, of course, when we got to reading books, there's great sci-fi books out there. I myself only read Star Trek novels from 2005 to about 2015. I still read them, but I have a lot more variety in my tastes now. Sci-fi can be very immersive. It takes the cool elements of science and combines them with drama and sometimes exploration and just gives you possibilities that don't really exist in any other genre. At least that's how I feel. And with sci-fi, you also can branch off into other genres, whether it's horror, steampunk, fantasy. There's all kinds of possibilities, to quote Spock. I mean, I guess you could probably do it with anything, but sci-fi really lends itself to multi-genre approaches.
I see it feel the same way with romance. It's a really good threader, if you will, because you can take sci-fi horror, steampunk, like you said. I particularly like sci-fi horror because that horror element of being in a situation where you're all about survival while trying to outwit some adversary of some sort is quite fascinating. One of the things that come to mind, even though I didn't like the movie at all, was Event Horizon. Sam Neill, the Lawrence Fishburne.
That movie gave me nightmares.
Yeah, I watched it and I said, I cannot watch this ever again. And
No.
I've watched horror. I can watch horror, but Event Horizon took it a whole different way. And I know why it did that, because it tapped into a realm of our spiritual nature that was quite terrifying. And other sci-fi have done that, but not to the extreme that Event Horizon did. But that's another subject for later on in the broadcast. But with Star Trek, it was going where no one has gone before. And as far as the farthest star is, we can get there. Star Trek had that element of adventure, the original series, and it had that motley crew following the stalwart captain. But sci-fi has changed from Star Trek into other elements as well. Like you say, mentioned Battlestar Galactica. I can mention Lost in Space. Some elements of Twilight Zone, Outer Limits. Some of these other ones have come on since then. So sci-fi really is a nice threader genre. And it's also great on its own. Like you said, it has a unique way of exploring some unique ideas. And so let's just talk about some of the ways that sci-fi uses various tropes that we're familiar with to explore some of these issues. One of my favorite ones, and it's a very interesting one, is the whole concept of parallel universes and or multi-universes. And there is a difference for those of you who are uninitiated in the conversation, but even the differences are very misty in their application. So let's try as we can to tackle what is the difference between a parallel universe and a multi-universe.
Can go back to Star Trek on that, because the mirror universe was a good example, parallel universe.
Right.
What we knew with Kirk and crew and the Enterprise, but then in that one episode, they got thrown into a parallel universe where basically everything that was good was bad and everything that was bad was good suddenly. The Federation wasn't the Federation, it was Terran Empire. They basically ruled by terror, as opposed to the Federation tried to be peaceful interactions with their neighbors, whereas the Terran Empire conquered. So it was a very easy comparison to see basically these two different approaches to the same characters in the same universe, but slightly different. And the thing that was really nice about the writing in that episode was that they explored the fact that the evil counterparts were immediately given away in the Federation universe, but Kirk and Scotty and McCoy and Uhura were able to blend in the evil universe because they were basically acting. It's not necessarily that they were smarter, but their point where they were coming from allowed them to imitate enough to get away with what they were doing to try and get back and to switch things back. And I thought that was interesting. That's a good example of good storytelling. So that's parallel, but multiverse type stuff is where you can have infinite universes. A good example from present day would be like, say, The Flash, where there could be who knows how many universes, Earth 2, Earth 3, Earth 27, Earth 38. And different things happen in those, but they're not necessarily related or it's just you can visit them, essentially. Different writers handle multiverses different ways, but the more universes you do, the more complicated it gets if you try to integrate them into some kind of regular story. Would you agree?
I do agree. And as you were talking about the multi-universes, I was thinking about the Cloverfield series, because the Cloverfield series is an excellent example of how they tackled the multi-universe, because they have multi-universes and different time periods flowing independently of each other. And so in the Cloverfield paradox, you have the creatures being very prominent, whereas in the first Cloverfield movie, they just arrived and we're just now seeing them. Clovey is the baby or something like that, as opposed to in the Cloverfield paradox, his monstrous form parts the skies. And I love the fact that you use the mirror universe from Star Trek, because that's probably where I got my affectation for beards, okay? Because Spock had a beard, and there was something so devilish about Spock having a beard and being completely logical. And that was the really good writing for his character, because even in the evil, quote unquote, universe, he's still quite logical. Because when Kirk questions him and says, how long do you think this can last? He says, I think 237 years or something like that.
Yeah.
And he said, it's not going to last long. And that's Spock. And that's brilliant, that there are some people, evil or not, they're quite logical.
It was really interesting also, and kind of chilling to hear Mirror Universe Spock say to Kirk, terror must be maintained.
Exactly. And that's what makes the whole trope so interesting. So you take a very popular episode, The Mirror Universe, and you apply it to sci-fi. That's what makes sci-fi so very interesting, is exploring these types of really interesting questions and scenarios. What would evil Alan look like in the parallel universe? I know what you would have. You would have this long beard. It would be this long beard. And your wife, Angel, she'll be like, that is not my husband. I want you to bring him back now.
Please.
So those are real fun. But what has happened, though, and this is our critique of the trope itself, is that it's done things to the genre that I think are a little disappointing, or not, or maybe not disappointing, but just...
You've gotten into lazy writing. Let's
just
cut to the chase.
Yeah. Okay, I was trying to be diplomatic, so... Okay, go ahead.
No, I mean, the problem that we've gotten into is people use multiverses, time travel, which is a whole other thing, and parallel universes to problem solve, to basically write themselves out of a mess. A good one I can think of is the Voyager episode. I think it's called Deadlock was the name of the episode, and it was one where Voyager came across an area of space near the Vidians. The ship got split into two versions that were tied together.
Right.
Voyager's getting really damaged at first by being in this area of space, and so the ship is being damaged, and Harry Kim gets blown out into space. One of the many times that Harry Kim dies throughout Voyager.
Yes.
And but they had a copy basically of him on this parallel Voyager. It wasn't a parallel universe, but it was a parallel situation. But and Naomi Wildman's child dies in birth in this, and so basically they have, hey, well, here's alternate Harry Kim and alternate Naomi Wildman. We'll just bring them from the other ship and let the other ship blow up. Sorry for the spoilers. It's been 20 years.
If you haven't seen it now.
Yeah. But anyway, it's like, okay, so we had the trauma of the characters dying, but it's okay because it's sci-fi. We'll just bring another set of the same characters from a parallel. And it was interesting at the time. It was clever writing, but it was also like kind of a cheat, Because and even now, one thing that was good about the writing is Harry gets to the end of the episode and is like, I'm not really from your Voyager. He's talking to Janeway. I'm not really from your Voyager, and you're not really my captain, but you are, and I am. And she's like, Harry, we're Starfleet. Weird is part of the job.
Exactly. On the same note, with a movie called Coherence that I saw from 2015. It's a low-budget film and explores parallel universes through the past of this comet. And that was very interesting because I can't imagine a comet having this type of effect where parallel universes start to collapse on each other. But whatever, we'll go with it. Okay, we'll go with it. And so what was really unique about that particular movie was that after the young lady, she chooses to go into another universe because she has a quote-unquote better life in that universe. But now she has to get rid of the girl who's already there. She has to get rid of her counterpart. So she knocks her out with this drug and then throws her in the bathroom. And then she sees her trying to come out the bathroom, so she runs and knocks her out again with the top of the toilet. She faints because you're in another universe, and it's kind of traumatic. So she faints, and then she wakes up, and her other self isn't there. And then all of a sudden, her boyfriend in that new universe gets a call from her, and it ends with him looking at her like, what is going on? Yeah. And I'm like, what's the rest of the story? I really want to know what happened. She's in a bind. She can't go back home. So that's when the parallel universe and multi-universe trope does get a little bit lazy. We don't really work through the problem. And it was really good in its execution, but its solution just, okay, we're done.
It's good for short stories. I mean, it reminds me of a short story that I wrote that I'm going to, Lord willing, turn into a series. It's called Singularity of Purpose. And basically, the main character is working with some friends at a university on a virtual reality device and accidentally gets transported into an alternate universe version of herself, then gets stuck there. And it's like, basically, what do you do when you basically go from your peaceful universe into one where your world has been conquered by aliens? If it's played right, if it's not just used as a way to solve, you've written yourself into a corner in your story, so hey, let's just send them off into another universe because then we've got fresh story ideas. No, that's not good. Stick with and resolve the situations where you're at, or start something new, but don't just, don't get lazy like that. And that's, unfortunately, there's just a lot of that's happening recently, whether it's movies or TV or books, and there's just lots more. We've been shown by past examples that you can do really clever stuff. You can jump in another direction without having to rely on time travel or a parallel universe to solve your problem.
Another thing, too, before we go into our next topic about our state of sci-fi and our opinion, is the parallel universe doesn't give us a foundation of learning how to learn from our mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
And this becomes extremely interesting because in the Christian worldview, the Bible says, "It's appointed unto man once to die, and after this the judgment." And so you only got one time to live. Like one girlfriend told me very recently, Alan, she said, time is the most precious thing God ever gave you, besides our salvation. It's the most precious thing he gave you. Time to serve him, time to do whatever, okay? With a parallel universe, you could just knock that out the water. I don't have to learn from my mistakes. I could go here and just make it right again.
One thing that sci-fi writers have done a good job with, I've seen a couple of different examples of when they deal with mortality. Like they say, for instance, you've got a character and their husband or the wife die in a car accident or die from an illness, but then they have the option to go to a parallel universe and have time with their husband or wife again, but it's this other universe's husband or wife. It's not them. Every time, it usually is, there's a dystopian twist put on it where basically you shouldn't do that. There's certain lines you shouldn't cross. And in that regard, parallel universes have been used as a warning, and that's good. I think that's good because that comes back and shows, no, you need to live with it. You need to deal with it. And if you don't, then you're going to spiral out of control. That's using sci-fi as a metaphor for real life. Accept death, accept tragedy, and go on, because if you don't, you're going to unleash literally a world of problems on yourself and everybody around you potentially.
Speaking of that, when we talk about a world of problems, another surging motif in science fiction is dystopian futures. And a lot of it, I believe, has to do with seeing our current real world situation where we are somewhat living in, I don't want to say dystopian, but you can definitely see just the thin line between normal that we're used to and then going to the point where a dystopian future comes. But as one of my former guests who's been on the show before said, his name is Travis Perry, he said, it's not that a dystopian future comes upon you rather suddenly, it's something that happens and ekes out over time. So let's talk about dystopian but dystopian futures and what that looks like in sci-fi today.
It's interesting, and there's a lot of different variations. And one thing I don't like about certain dystopians, although people have the freedom to write whatever they want, well, let's say like The Handmaid's Tale, where it's used to attack any form of religion or Christianity by saying, well, if we let them loose in the near future, they'll do this, or in this alternate universe, it's like this, and then you've got commentators who look at it and have no clue what they're looking at and say, oh, well, see, this is the way that things are. And it's like, unfortunately, these dystopians, they tend to have some type of evil religious figure, and too many times sci-fi has used the science fiction trappings to attack Christianity in particular. I'm going to be doing a dystopian series, and it will be taking a look at certain aspects of current culture. You can use dystopian stories constructively, but yeah, there's a danger because it can get so depressing when you're depicting, especially suffering, because I mean, in order for something to be dystopian, it has to be bad. Something went wrong. Either there was, society was, wiped out by nuclear war, or the Terminators, or something happened, and usually there's only a fraction of humanity left, or humanity exists but is suffering way much more, or there's disease, or there's just things that are, there's got to be something to make it dystopian, or they're being ruled by a iron fist government. Something is going on, and sci-fi will take it a step further and say that other worlds and aliens are being affected in this way. You got to be careful. There was they even did it in the Star Trek books. They had the Borg come in for kind of a final attack, and they wiped out basically 40% of the Federation worlds. And the only way that those worlds could possibly be restored would be through terraforming in the future, and they still wouldn't be like the paradises they once were. But at least the positive was that the Federation was trying, and they were trying to bring hope back and things like that. But you just got to be careful, because you don't want to get lost in the misery. There's got to be a point to it. And if good writing will take the misery and transform it into whatever the solution to that dystopian is. But you got to watch out for what we call the nihilistic elements of it, when it's just dystopian for the sake of dystopian. Misery for the sake of misery, and all life is terrible, and why are we here type of writing.
And that can get, like you said, quite depressing, and it takes the hope of sci-fi, which is always exploring and getting better and improving on our understanding of the world and universe around us. And that's something that sci-fi is really good at, is showing that, hey, the more we begin to know, the more fascinating it becomes. But I don't ever think we'll get to a point where, okay, we're tapped out. I don't think that will ever happen. We're still learning about the human body, which is a universe in and of itself, and finding out there's a depth of information. The more we keep digging, the more we keep finding out that we don't know, which is fascinating, as Spock would say. And when you mentioned about the dystopian for Star Trek, I am remembering the Orville. And the Orville, as you know, is Seth MacFarlane's tribute and ode to Star Trek. And I actually like the Orville. The writing in the second season was much better than in the first season. But the first season was just giving us an idea of what we can expect from the series. And there's the storyline, and I'm spoiling for anybody who's seen it. In the storyline, you find out this AI race that had been prevalent in the alternate timeline, it had become completely dystopian. They wiped out the Planetary Alliance. Like in Star Trek, they wiped it out completely. And so our motley crew, they're all scattered all over the universe now, trying to just stay away from this AI. So they did that too. But then there was always that little element of hope in there. And what I like about sci-fi, as you were talking about dystopian, is that another aspect they go into is individuals versus collectives. And both of these have a strength and a weakness. And so let's talk about that, because in the Orville, with the alternate timeline, it was from one woman's decision that actually led to the whole thing getting corrupted. And it's and you may say, well, that really is. But when you watch the first season and the second season and read the comic books in between, you're like, oh my gosh. And I love that Seth MacFarlane put that element in there, that your decisions can really make a big impact on the world around you.
Oh, yeah.
And it wasn't even like it affected, it was because she made that decision that this didn't happen, then this didn't happen, then this didn't happen. And I love that element. So let's talk about that.
Well, I mean, one sci-fi movie that I distinctly remember is called Sliding Doors with Gwyneth Paltrow. It was two different realities, and one was if she made the subway train, and one if she didn't, the sliding doors with the subway train doors. And so on the one where she got on the subway train, she got back, and even though her boyfriend was cheating on her, it's just this whole reality happened, and she got pregnant, but then I think she ends up dying or something like that. And then when she didn't get to the subway in time, then she got home and she caught him cheating, completely different set of circumstances. And it was all based on whether she made it on the subway train or not. And it wasn't like out in space sci-fi, but it was just that looking through that lens of one decision, if you were fast enough to get on the train or if you weren't. and how that could completely change how things. So that comes back to your point about, those little decisions, in this case, the individual, how that affected everything around them. They did that in Star Trek as well. I think of the Year of Hell two-parter from Voyager.
Yeah, that was a good one.
Their decision to trek on into Krenim space anyway caused all these horrible things to happen, versus them just accepting the warning of the Krenim ship. Hey, this area's in dispute. Okay, we're just passing through. We'll go around. Okay, problem solved.
Yeah, exactly. And I was thinking about Star Wars too, because Star Wars, well, they don't have an alternate timeline, but Star Wars, its whole thing is based off of individuals making these decisions. So the individual in sci-fi can be extremely important, but then when you contrast it with the collectivism, I hope I'm saying it right. So what's your thoughts about that?
It depends on how it's applied, of course. There's been some very interesting sci-fi stories that have used a collective. I mean, you can even go back to Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where it was a collective society of these plant creatures that were basically just choosing to supplant the human race. You could literally see that as an analogy for the collective supplanting the individual, because they would all do this stuff together. They even had this thing this really scary scene at the end where they all like scream at the same time. It's very weird. But another one I thought of was the Borg, because the Borg technically were super efficient. I mean, you have basically all these hundreds of thousands of beings on this cube or sphere or whatever geometric shape they want their ship to be, but they're all working together. And so they were all, they could repair their ships faster, they could process information faster, they could come up with things, but they did a good job of showing the downside. What if your collective is evil? What if your collective is conquering?
Yeah.
And then on top of it, they couldn't innovate. They could only process information like a computer. And so that always gave, in this case, the Starfleet and Federation gave them a chance, but when they didn't know what they were going up against, like at the, in TNG, the Battle of Wolf 359, they didn't know what they were going up against. They got slaughtered. An enemy that it's not dependent on a captain, and it's all of them working together. And then they later introduced the Queen. Okay, that's when it got kind of silly. But the initial idea of the Borg was a pure collective, and it was powerful and it was scary because technically you could destroy like 80% of their ship and they could still function.
And I was, of course, thinking of 709's character, because she struggles with that when she comes onto Voyager. Now, we know really why she was there in the real world, but for Voyager, when she came on board, they did a really good job, I think, with her mentorship with Captain Janeway, because she's learning how to be an individual, and she recognizes the flaws of individualism versus that purity with the collective. But she also recognized that the individual should not be completely blotted out within the collective. There's a scene where she is by herself on the ship, and they're going through this radiation nebula. This nebula took like a month to get through it or something like that. And she was fine at first, but she hated being alone. And that was actually a very good episode. Then she starts to really hallucinate, really, really bad. I mean, I was like, wow, I hope I never have hallucinations like that. Because it'd be horrifying. But at the end of the day, then she goes, I didn't want to be alone. And that was an individual fear that she had. That's what made that particular episode unique. It brings me to our next point in our discussion about sci-fi and the state, because with the individual versus the collective, we now have to talk about the nihilistic trend that's happening, because in nihilism, neither the collective or the individual matters. It becomes very, very dark. So let's talk about that. And why do you think that's becoming more prevalent in sci-fi?
Well, I think, ironically, it started from other elements of culture finding their way into sci-fi. Now, I mean, there was always some dark elements. I mean, you go back to, Alien and Aliens, and there were dark elements, but again, there was that positive in the end. But by the time you got to like the third Alien and fourth Alien movies,
I'm sorry, there are no third and fourth Alien movies. I know that's what the universe is telling you. Now, joking.
Shouldn't have been. Yes.
In a parallel universe, they did not exist.
They did not exist. They don't count.
But go on,
it's
please.
sort of like Star Trek V: The Final Frontier. It didn't happen. There are not 78 decks on the Enterprise. I'm sorry.
No, they are.
Yeah. Anyway, getting back to the topic, because a lot of films by around 2000. Well, you also started having more and more disaster movies, sci-fi disaster movies, and those tended to kind of introduce those elements as well, because whether it was natural disasters or whether it was, another natural disaster like a planet or a moon or a sun is something, what was it? Like the Rift, where it's like, something happens and, the planet's going to break itself apart or whatever, Those types of movies became more prevalent, and so some of them had good endings, some of them didn't have good endings, and so we started seeing more and more of the negative creeping in, and then it got to be where almost all movies and all television shows had these darker, cringy elements where it's like basically there is no hope. There's all these bad things. You're fighting against an enemy that you can't win against, or an alien species you can't win against, or space itself is the enemy, or we're all going to die. It was reflecting the psyche of these writers, and they were selling these ideas to studios or to publishing houses and stuff. And so, it all comes back to writing, to me, that you can't have a dystopian or a dark story unless the writer wants it to be dark. There's rare exceptions where a studio will say, okay, well, I know you want to do, happy mellow, but we want it dark. But most of the time it came from the writer themselves or writers. As we have moved into the present day, I think a lot of people are losing hope, honestly. And I think that's creeping into writing. And I think people expect bad. I think people want dark. They've come to it. It's been written so long, people expect it now. I mean, how else could you have something like Game of Thrones? People want it. People are expecting it. They're expecting these dystopian realities, and if they do well in ratings, if they sell well, then there's going to be more of them.
It's sort of like the Zack Snyder's cut of Justice League.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people really enjoyed it. I have not watched it because, again, I'm not really a superhero. After Avengers, I kind of got out of it. But the first Avengers movie, I should say, I got out of it. I did watch Black Panther.
That was a great movie.
It was really good. Oh, it was awesome. And I hurt my leg that day, and it was well worth it. It was well worth seeing it. But it brings me to another sci-fi show, which I've mentioned on the show before, called Rick and Morty. And I actually like Rick and Morty. But the writers were nihilistic. They said, it's a nihilistic worldview, and they are not going to respond to what they call unanswerable questions about life. So nihilism becomes this element, and people find that they don't have any hope. And so because they don't have any hope, what they try to do, which goes to our next point, is take a very fluidic approach to morals. So whatever you want to do, go ahead and do it. Your happiness, quote unquote, is so important. And happiness, as we know, is very fleeting, because we'll say, oh my gosh, I'll be so happy if I got this chocolate dip ice cream, and we eat it and it's gone. I'm not happy anymore. Okay, so we can take that to many different ways. So let's talk about the fluidic morals of current sci-fi, because even the old sci-fi, it was there, because I've read some old sci-fi stuff. It was there, but it wasn't, how do I say? It was a contrast. It wasn't a norm.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was things that the old way. I mean, it's always been there, but there used to be standards. So certain things couldn't, happen in sci-fi, especially, television or, books or movies. But I mean, we can still go back to the original series of Star Trek. Kirk slept with everything that moved.
Yes, he did. He was the original non-racist guy on the planet. Okay, he was doing his part for space exploration for sure.
And making sure that underpopulation was never a problem.
never a problem.
But no, it's changed to reflect the times. I mean, I read a Star Trek novel, a Next Generation novel, that I enjoyed the novel in general, but it kind of was offsetting that they now had Geordi LaForge the chief engineer of the Enterprise, in a polyamorous relationship with two women. It was just like almost an afterthought. It was one scene out of the entire book, and I'm like, I've been reading these books for a while. I didn't know about this, you know. And it's like, and Geordi? I mean, so I guess I think the joke they're trying to play is that Geordi couldn't ever get any girlfriend during the entire Next Generation series, so I guess they've overcompensated. But I mean, they've done the same thing with Worf. Worf can't keep a wife or a girlfriend; they always die.
Yes, yes, yes. And that's what I mean. So it's that fluidic morals here, and there's other things that happen, and then sometimes the fluid morals, they actually get in the way of the actual story.
Yeah.
Because if you were to keep it a certain way, that story is actually stronger for having that moral standard than if it wasn't. And I think because people say, well, we'll do whatever makes you happy, we forget that God has standards for us, and he has boundaries for us. Well, now, we don't like them. Like, you put a kid in one of those playpens. He doesn't like it, but to keep him from running into the vacuum that you're currently using right now to vacuum the floor. Hey, don't touch the stove. You don't let the kid out there turn on the stove and walk off. You know, you have boundaries for a reason.
The thing of it is that there's always, even going back to the Bible, there's always been humankind's culture and God's law in the Old Testament, and then, you know, God writing his law in our hearts from the New Testament, you know, the new standards of doing things through Christianity. But it didn't mean that the Old Testament was, you know, thrown out the window, that the Ten Commandments went away. The laws, the morals were still there. It's just that human culture always fights against God's morality because people want what they want. I'm just going to say it. You know, people say love is love. And okay, but you want to say that applying to 6 people being in a relationship or 3 people being in a relationship, or this thing or that thing, or this person wants to be with animals. Where do you draw the line? You know, and people don't want lines. That's the problem.
Yeah.
And so you will find the elements of the culture reaching in and reflected in people's writing. There are certain writers that are very political, you know, and they'll put it in their sci-fi. I mean, that's how you get these overwrought disaster movies about climate change. No matter what your feeling is about climate change, everybody agrees that the movies are ridiculous.
Yeah. And I mean, climate change has been, mind you, I'm not going to go into it. For those of you who've been following the show for some time, you know I talked to Dr. Beisner from the Cornwall Alliance about this. So just go to any show throughout the archives, you can find it. But one thing is that I get so irritated sometimes because it's like, is there anything else you could say that caused this problem? Is there anything else? You know, right now I will go for alien invasion. Right now, like, I will just go for it. And it's not that I don't care about the planet or anything like that. Do not misunderstand me. But you can tell indoctrination as opposed to a good idea of a story. And
good point.
You know, I was watching what was that? I didn't really care for it. Sweet Tooth. Was it Sweet Tooth? Yeah, Sweet Tooth. And
yeah, I didn't see it.
You're not missing nothing. But there's a scene in there where she literally goes on a 5-minute sermon about the reason why she's protecting the wildlings, which are these half-breeds, you know, is because of climate change. Literally, that's what happened. I was like, really? I'm like, really? We couldn't get the climate change out. I mean, this whole movie's about this kid being a half-breed deer and a boy, which is really interesting. Okay, that's interesting. And then the reason why she's on this quest is because of climate change. Okay. You know, so it's like, we'll go with it. Okay. Mind you, again, I'm not talking about climate change. That's another subject for another time. But all I'm saying is the lazy writing starts to become a thing.
And another thing, too, you just brought back to my attention a couple of things. I love Star Trek, but I got really irritated with Discovery's 3rd season because the main thing, I mean, there was a lot of things they did that were funky. There were a lot of lazy writing elements, in my opinion, but you got critical race theory just there on the screen through the way they decided to do the scenes, because you had the characters of this race were here. The characters, you know, were all in a scene together or were together as a couple, and then you had these characters of this identity were always together in scenes. And so you literally had segregation without being explained, just shoved in front of you, And it really hurt the storytelling because you had certain characters that had been there since the beginning, didn't get a single line in the entire season, and it was just arbitrary. And that's a cultural element. There are people who believe in critical race theory and practice it, but it doesn't make for good television. It doesn't make for good storytelling. You are literally trying to force by example through sci-fi. It doesn't belong. Tell a good story.
And that is what happens when I think you're trying to get a message across as opposed to telling a story, because it doesn't have to be so blatant. I mean, I may not agree with you, and that's okay, but I don't want to shove down my throat like like Christians were accused of shoving religion down their throat with some of this stuff, right? We were all accused. You're shoving your religion down my throat. Okay, now you're doing the same thing. Okay, but it's different because you're different, and I don't like that. Again, I can watch stuff that's very different from my own worldview. I can't. I'm able to. Me and you have talked about it. We can be entertained, or we can be even thought provoked. Like, wow, that's interesting. I never thought about it like that. Something of that nature. But when you start to shove it down my throat, that's when I'm like, really? Now we're not telling a story anymore. Now you're preaching to me.
Yeah, exactly. And people don't want to call it a religion, but it is. And some people have even called it a cult. I wouldn't disagree.
It's definitely a belief system. There's a belief system there.
Right.
Sure.
And it's like, you got the right to your belief system until you start hurting others. And the question is, are you hurting others through writing? No, you may kill your ratings. But the point that we're getting to is that, these cultural aspects or these fluid morals, pushing, like making a character a certain way or changing their race from what they were in the original source material, which it's been done right. I mean, The Flash did it right with Iris. Nobody cares that Iris was originally white. Who cares? It was written well. It was a single element in a billion other elements of the story. That's good. That's how it's supposed to be. This is who we cast. Okay, that's fine. But, let's say if Iris was white for the first 2 seasons and then they basically got rid of her and brought in an alternate universe Iris that was black, that would be weird.
Like with the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, when they got rid of the one Vivian and got rid of Vivian. And Jazz was like, your mama looks different.
Yeah. I see this as a theme in what we're discussing today, is that it's like we're talking about the difference between good writing and preachy writing. And I'll even bring it back to our own, you and I, our writing. We're Christian storytellers. We try and weave it into our story so it's not distracting. It becomes a point. It becomes the point of the story, but it doesn't have to smack you upside the face and say, hey, look here. It's just, it's supposed to, God is supposed to be there.
Yeah.
Jesus is supposed to be there, and it comes out. It's not supposed to break the immersion. It's supposed to be part of the immersion.
Exactly. And that's one of the reasons why we're not saying, oh, you can't have CRT in your stories. I'm not saying that at all. Like I said, like you said earlier, you can write what you want, okay? Being creative is an ability that God gave all of us in some capacity, and we all have that ability to do that. Now, I just don't want to shove down my throat. I don't want to be preached to, just like you wouldn't want me to preach to you. That's exactly what it is. Like my one story no one's read. It's like only 4 people has read this one. It's called House of Hadaway, and I'm only mentioning it because maybe someone will take pity and buy another copy. But it's my romantic space opera, and it's not a quote unquote Christian book, but it's nothing off the wall or anything. And it was actually my response to Rick and Morty, because it was so nihilistic, and even though I enjoy the show, it was so nihilistic. So what I did, I created a universe where Earth owns 2/3 of the galaxy, if you will. And they are the creme de la creme of the Milky Way Planetary Alliance, okay? The MWPA, because I couldn't think of anything else. And and Earth is it. The alien races want to be on Earth. Humans are highly revered almost, and everyone goes to Earth. Earth is the leader in exploration. They run the alliance, and I wanted that because I said, gee, why is humanity always back of the bus, mildew on the tires. And that comes to our next point about space exploration, which is really exciting to see it now in the real world, the beginning of it. Because I'm not leaving Earth, by the way. I'm not leaving Earth at all, okay? But to see it